Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. As Israel's siege of the Gaza Strip continues to cause death, famine, and mass displacement, Canada is among many countries signaling discomfort with the carnage. But even as our officials shift their tone and language somewhat, words are not being followed up by concrete actions. To discuss Canada's ongoing complicity in genocide and institutional attempts to disavow responsibility for the carnage, I'm joined today by Elle Jones, professor, poet, activist, and Breach contributor. Hi, Elle.
Hi, Desmond.
Before we unravel a few different threads of all of this, I just want to get your general perception of how conversations about Israel's military aggression are evolving in Canada, from government, from politicians, institutions, from mainstream media.
I think what we're seeing now is, I think there's been a very decisive shift in public opinion, which is backed up by polls, right? Very much generationally, but even across, what we might call, the normal population has very much swung, if not to the side of Palestine, at least against what Israel is doing. And we've seen that reflected. So now a majority of Canadians disagree with what Israel is doing in Gaza, believe that, there are war crimes being committed and so forth. And so what we actually are seeing now is how much our government is now out of step with the vast majority of people. So you have just ordinary people on the ground, like not lefties, not activists, not people being in the Palestine movement for a long time, just like your average person. Like, I think it's terrible that Israel is starving those children, and our politicians still holding the line mostly on this idea that we still have to support Israel, that, this is somehow still this existential battle, that we're still friends with Israel. So increasingly so, I think it's been the case throughout this whole time. But I think it's even more stark that Israel is a project of the elites. And the support for Israel is very much around how elites hold power, how settler colonialism holds power, and the imperial outposts of these Western nations. And that is increasingly out of step with how populations actually understand what's going on.
Right. I want to zoom in first on the media specifically, on how media narratives are starting to shift. As you say, popular opinion starts to shift as well, and has continued to shift, really. One thing we've seen, and I think something many of us anticipated, is that as the conditions on the ground in Gaza have gotten worse, the mainstream media commentaries on Israel's conduct are definitely shifting. And I have a few examples, Elle. So from the Toronto Star, in an editorial from last week, I'm going to quote it. "The impulse to rid the world of Hamas, which since its inception has been dedicated to the destruction of Israel, is entirely understandable. But nothing can justify the level of civilian death and suffering that we are witnessing. Nothing can justify Israel's unrelenting violence, which, whatever its motivations, poses a mounting threat to an entire people. Violence that every day adds more weight to the allegations of genocide." So that's from a recent Toronto Star editorial from last week. This is Andrew Coyne writing last week in the Globe and Mail. He was, of course, very full-throatedly supportive of Israel's invasion when it began. Quote, "If Israel's critics were too quick to accuse it of excesses in the war's early going, its defenders seem too willing to excuse or look the other way at what is happening now, nearly 2 years on." Unquote. And then referring to Israeli leaders who are also more and more calling for an end to the conflict, Coyne says, quote, "Israel, they argue, has achieved the bulk of its military objectives. Nothing of any importance is to be gained by continuing the campaign. It is not going to extinguish the last of Hamas's fighters, or not at remotely acceptable a cost. Neither will it save the remaining October 7 hostages, of whom just 20 are thought to have survived. It is time, in the immortal words of Senator George Aiken, to declare victory and get out." Unquote. And then finally, Al, I know that this column from Robin Urbach, also in the Globe and Mail last week, caught your attention. So citing shifting opinion against Israel in the United States, Urbach writes that, quote, "Mr. Netanyahu's perception might be that the game is rigged, that Israel will always be held to an impossible standard, and that the international press will never report the situation fairly. And perhaps that's true. But Israel cannot afford to play. The country more than most needs friends internationally Its military wins will be ephemeral. Israel's enemies always seem to rise up, rebuild, and attack again. But Israel's reputational loss will be generational. Mr. Netanyahu has lost on this front, and badly. End of quote. So mainstream media criticism, I think it's pretty clear, including from Israel's supporters, is certainly escalating. What do you make of it, Al?
I think we see just reading them like that, I think gives us a good gallery of exactly how accountability can be denied while shifting position, while not acknowledging that you shifted, while also refusing to account for what made you wrong in the first place, right? So we see in all these articles, for example, the idea that, like, oh, those wacky leftists were being crazy at the beginning, but now we have to admit. And I'm like, or were we correct right after you were refusing that we were correct, and it took you 22 months to see what everybody could see? And that's not a gloating like, oh, we were right. It's just factual, right? Israel was talking about Amalek immediately after October 7th. They announced they were going to annex the Gaza Strip. We were hearing about human animals. None of this is news. They said they were going to starve Gaza. So none of this just emerged in the last month. This has been a 22-month project that has been carried out exactly how we were told it would be carried out. We're seeing in the States a lot of this around, like, this is why you should have voted for Kamala, even though, of course, Kamala was like shouting down protesters and saying, I'm speaking. So all of this is, on the one hand, we see that genre of media, which is refusing to take account of what you actually backed, refusing to take any accountability, to acknowledge that your outlets and yourself spread lies, like deliberately did not put Palestinian voices on the air, silenced Palestinian protest, like all the things that happened, called every protest anti-Semitic, reprinted uncritically everything from Israel, everything from pro-Israel advocacy groups, on and on and on. They've done no accounting for that, and they go, oh, no, now we're shocked. It shocks the conscience. So what does that mean if you can't even take accountability for what you did? And then, we see this other genre, which is the Robin Urbach style, which is that all that is wrong here isn't that Israel is committing genocide. It's just that it's bad PR. So, I mean, this is, of course, incredibly laughable because we know that Israel commits millions of dollars to propaganda, right? And we've seen that propaganda repeated on and on all our mainstream media stations. And then Israel's problem is that they naively did not anticipate a propaganda war, is the kind of line that Robin Urbach takes. She, for example, references a UN report that explicitly says there's no systematic evidence of Hamas stealing aid, and says, despite a UN report, that Hamas systematically steals aid. So she quite literally says the opposite within the article. She repeats. So throughout the article, we see continual debunked statements by Urbach, even as she claims this kind of propaganda does not exist, and then basically says the problem has been optics. And if we want to save Israel, we need to understand that seeing these starving babies, it's not that it's wrong that the babies are starving. It's wrong that it makes Israel look bad. And not even Israel, just Netanyahu. So you see these various narratives, which are all about now mouthing this kind of, oh, it's so sad, while, of course, holding the line on what we actually do and taking no accountability to Palestinians primarily, and then also to all the people who lost their jobs, all the people who had their reputation smeared, all the outlets that participated in firing their own journalists and running articles on people like Sarah Jama, uncritically calling them anti-Semites. This all happened at their outlets. And they're never going to look back at that and say we were wrong. And so in some ways, I think it's more cowardly and more disgusting and more contemptible to do that than to actually be a true believer. I think there's something that's even worse about having participated in this, changing your mind as such, refusing to even acknowledge it, and then to continue on as though nothing happened, as though you were always right.
As you say, I think we're probably never going to hear from many people who excused all of this that Israel actually acted with total disregard for civilian life, like not just now with things like starvation and famine being evident to the public, but well before, that there was really no plan to end this siege, that it began with no very clear objective that could be defined, like the total elimination of Hamas, for example, not exactly a realistic objective. When, how, and where does that ever end? We don't even know now with this new talk about the entire occupation of Gaza City. What's the purpose? When does it end? And so it sounds like you're saying, El, that this is actually all just a little too late.
And of course, another narrative we're being sold is, well, if you say that, you're the one that doesn't care about Palestinians because you care more about being right than you do about, welcoming people into the big tent. And that's not the point. The point isn't being right. There's no vindication or victory in being, right over the body of Palestinians. The point is, A, that we did this already. We did this with the Iraq War. And the same people that cheerleaded on the Iraq War, and we know throughout history, there is never, despite one of the things I think we hold on to this idea that one day justice will come and those who were in the wrong will be exposed in this particular way. They will be in front of the Hague. They will have consequences. And then we will be somehow vindicated. And I think one of the things that's hard to live with is that we have to understand that that does not occur. Maybe in a few token cases, right? So a few lower level soldiers might get prosecuted. We saw this with Abu Ghraib, right? They prosecuted some of the lower level people while the architects of the whole thing, like Rumsfeld, got away scot-free. And this, not only do they get away scot-free, they fail upwards, right? Like they continue to be rewarded. And I think that is almost impossible for us to cope with psychologically. And so saying you did not take accountability is not about saying, we need people, like we need to be right. It's acknowledging that you do this over and over and over again, whether it's around policing, whether it's around war, whether it's around Israel, where people are correct and the mistake they make is being correct too early. You persecute those people in real ways. This wasn't just name calling. Sarah Jama got censured by the legislature for calling for a ceasefire.
And then kicked out by her own party.
Moxie's workers that came out and waved at the parade lost their job. People were fired. Students were expelled and suspended and disciplined. People in the States are being deported. Like, this is real consequences. Journalists lost their jobs and livelihoods. People being banned from giving speeches. They've been smeared as anti-Semites. They've lost opportunities both publicly and behind the scenes. And this has gone on. And that is nothing compared to the Palestinian lives that have been lost. But the same people that perpetrate all that then expect that we're supposed to hand wave it and that this is somehow normal. And I think so that's the point, is how do you continue to move through your life as though nothing happened, take no accountability, and not even recognize, even narratively, that maybe the same media outlet you're writing this for printed lies about October 7th, and maybe you could account for that in an editorial. You were the ones that had guests on the air that spread these lies. You did that directly. And when people challenged you and wrote CBC and wrote CTV and wrote the Globe and Mail, you wrote back and told them they were wrong. The mechanism by which this is taking place publicly is the same we saw in Iraq. It's the same we saw in Afghanistan. It's the same we see over and over again. And I think that's what's so difficult for us to come to terms with, is the very same people that did this with Iraq are doing this again with Israel, and will do it again 10 years, 20 years from now. And the reality is there's nothing we will ever be able to do to hold them for account. And of course, nothing that will bring back all the lives that were lost. And living with that, I think, is what is absolutely untenable for people. And it's what's creating in people not only rage, but I think with, legitimate psychological damage in people that have to witness this.
Just one point about the Robin Urbach piece in terms of talking specifically about stolen aid, which you brought up, Elle. She says here that in terms of the decision by Israel to blockade and to stop aid from coming into the region, quote, Israel defends this decision by insisting that food aid is stolen, which by the UN's own data does happen routinely. And she has a citation there for some UN figures. But of course, that's not quite accurate, because the claim is specifically by Israel that it is Hamas that is stealing the aid, and that's the reason why it can't be distributed the way it needs to be, that it can't be allowed into the region in the way that it needs to be. As you said, Al, there's no systemic information that that's been happening, no proof been provided.
She, of course, also, as you see in many of these articles, says, oh, it's just a fringe group of, lunatics that were screaming about this. But if everything these so-called fringe people are screaming about has happened, how is that still fringe? So again, the crime is being right early. The crime is actually being able to use your critical mind and see and think what was actually happening. So none of this, you didn't have to be some kind of Sherlock Holmes detective here. These are public statements. We saw in South Africa's case, the ICJ, they made a compendium of TikToks of soldiers blowing up property, of, statements made by government. Over a year and a half that we've had these statements collected, and they just made this collection of genocidal statements, but somehow it's supposed to have been fringe and ridiculous to have taken that at their word and to not be surprised now that Israel has done the very thing when they threatened to defund UNRWA so that they could starve Palestinians. Now they have done it. The other thing, of course, we are seeing is the shift into talking about this as a humanitarian crisis, but still not talking about Israel's deliberate actions. So, as though this starvation is happening in a vacuum. This is another way we see the media talking.
We've now seen that as the narrative that starvation is becoming entrenched and more widespread within Gaza, as that narrative proliferates in the mainstream media, we've seen this very interesting switch in narrative from places like France, the United Kingdom, and of course now Canada, that it's time to recognize Palestinian statehood, right? Not to address specifically the, as they call it, humanitarian crisis, but to say actually that what Palestinians need is a state. And with everything else happening, now is the time for us to talk about that. So just 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced Canada's intention to recognize a Palestinian state at the United Nations General Assembly in next month in September. So the United Kingdom and France had made similar comments just days before that. And Carney said that the ideal would have been for Palestinians to secure statehood through a peace process between themselves and Israel, but that, quote, regrettably, this approach is no longer tenable, unquote. And Carney also said that Canada's recognition of Palestine would hinge on several conditions, including that the state be totally demilitarized, that it hold elections next year, which seems almost impossible given the current circumstances, and that Hamas would have no role in the state's future governance. So first of all, Elle, how important do you think that this announcement is, given the wider realities of war and dispossession in Gaza and in the West Bank?
I don't think we've seen anything from Canada that suggests that Canada has any interest in justice in Palestine and any interest in Palestinian freedom at all. So what we see, and also from France and from the UK, is these very conditional statements, not only putting conditions upon Palestinians, but also this idea, if Israel doesn't stop, then we'll be forced to recognize a state. So either you think a state is what Palestinians need or you don't. And if you haven't supported and don't think they have, how does Israel's actions dictate what Palestinians are entitled to, right?
But the United Kingdom has basically come out and said that this will be the consequence. Like, we will punish Israel by giving Palestinians their statehood. Like, it's literally as if the statehood and sovereignty of one people is in the hands of a different group of people.
Right. And this is the whole colonial imperial narrative we see enacted, that we're going to grant you statehood. And so it's contingent upon the Western powers, who then deny that Israel is a settler imperial project while literally demonstrating that. But you can't have a military, so you can't have what every other state has. And you're going to live next door to people that are armed, that we actually physically arm, that we're giving arms to, and then not going to let you have any arms. So what do you think is going to happen there? But just the very notion that somehow it's democratic to dictate to another state the conditions where they will have elections, who they can elect, that this is all going to be conditional. And that, of course, leaving completely aside that the notion that not one power has simply said there needs to be a democratic state inside Israel where everyone has equal rights. Like, what is this ongoing support for an ethno-state? Why is every country still acting like there is no other solution but a two-state solution, as if one state isn't a possibility? There's no even indication that there's different views on this within Palestine, that this is not the one thing that people want, and B, that the idea that Israel can't even imagine a state where everybody could live under the same law, where everybody could have access to the same political powers, where there wouldn't be second-class citizens, and then deny that this is an apartheid state. So this is not specific to Israel. I am not for ethno-states existing anywhere in the world. Everybody should live democratically, as you say, within their own country. It should be stunning to us that we have this being advocated, that you can have your little Bantustan, but you're not to have full democratic rights, and we can never imagine you having rights within your own state. How does that make sense?
Well, I also think that we can easily imagine a situation when this question comes to the United Nations next month, where Canada, is talking about statehood and all these other countries are talking about statehood. And meanwhile, this famine inside of Gaza is way worse of a situation than it even is right now. And so, I know that many people are worried that this recognition of Palestinian statehood is meant to be a distraction from Canada's unwillingness to impose more harsh penalties against Israel, including sanctions.
And not only that, I'm
for
going to interrupt you, but also
No, go
just to
ahead.
say that, for example, the Knesset has on the Jerusalem Metropolitan Bill is something that's being proposed. This will annex communities within Jerusalem. So this is in the West Bank, and so part of the goal here is to Judaize, as they would say, the holy city, right? Remove Palestinian communities from Jerusalem, and the plan is to essentially cut off communities within Jerusalem, which would make it impossible to even imagine a Palestinian state. So to say that even in areas like the West Bank, which isn't getting as much attention as Gaza, we know that settler violence has increased. We know that Israel is continually expanding the settlements. And we know at the same time they are annexing Palestinian communities. So this idea that there's going to be a Palestinian state at the same time as countries like Canada that are supposed to recognize that the settlements are illegal have done absolutely, I think we sanctioned like 4 settlers, have done absolutely nothing to prevent settlers and are sitting by while the Knesset continues to annex Palestinian territory. So how is this state going to emerge? Where is this Palestinian state coming from? So it absolutely makes no sense that somehow through continuing to sell Israel weapons, through continuing to support them diplomatically, from continuing to declare yourself Israel's greatest friend, continuing to allow starvation of Palestinians, to continue to call for disarmament, do all these things, and somehow, out of the goodness of its heart, Israel, after 76 plus years, is going to magically just manifest a Palestinian state. And that, it is so ridiculous. It just makes, and this is what sold to us as serious foreign policy by the adults, right? So this is what the adults in the room are proposing, and what us fringe lunatics are not smart enough to see because we're so busy, waving our Palestinian flags and just screaming instead of being the adults that are looking for real solutions. And the real solution is this. It is completely disrespectful of Palestinian statehood. It completely, of course, as always, ignores that Palestinians are a people with their own solutions. So this continues to treat Palestinians as unhuman, subhuman, incapable of making decisions around their own freedom. This all has to be at the whim and control of the Western powers.
I want to play a clip from a question that was asked to Prime Minister Carney from CTV reporter Judy Trin. And this was at a press conference that he held in recent days. I just want to play this and get some quick thoughts from you, Elle. So let's hear from the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, given that you have said that Canada will recognize a Palestinian state, and given that Prime Minister Netanyahu has an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, and yet he is still considering and he wants to take over parts of Gaza City, will the Canadian government consider sanctions against Israel?
Thank you for the question. We are working on multiple fronts to try to bring a level of stability to the region, then security, then peace to the region. And in terms of those fronts, yes, working with allies, working with the French, working with the British, working with partners in the Middle East, other partners in the Middle East, to work towards stabilization of the situation. And we don't see the road. What we see is the erosion of the possibility of a two-state solution because of facts on the ground, actions on the ground. And that's why we made the announced the intention predicated on various factors that we did. But what we're also doing, and again, I want to bring it right back to where we are today, is doing what we can under extremely difficult circumstances to provide humanitarian aid to those suffering in Gaza with our Jordanian partners, but very importantly, with directly with the Canadian Armed Forces. Earlier this week, just under 22,000 pounds of aid brought through Cyprus and airdropped into Gaza. And that's the forces at its best in one of the worst situations in the world.
Prime Minister, are sanctions on the table against Israel? Is that being discussed?
Look, there's various routes, immediate assistance, the work we're doing, as I say, with partners. We've made announcements. I'm not on the cusp of making another announcement at this point.
I bet you he doesn't have that many ums when you ask him a question about the banks.
Well, you see, he was a little bit annoyed at the follow-up question that was a very direct, "Are sanctions on the table?" He looked away for just a slight moment, and he seemed to be a little bothered by this follow-up. But I thought Judy Trin did a decent job there, because what I'm not seeing from a whole bunch of mainstream media who have access to Mark Carney on a regular basis is like that sense of urgency. You say that this is a humanitarian crisis that needs an immediate response, and then you're talking about like aid drops, which are extremely dangerous and completely ineffective in terms of the scope of the problem. I would have loved to see, and still want to see, more pressure like that question from Judy Trin directly about what is going to be the follow-up. You're talking a lot about statehood. You're talking a lot about these things that are down the road. What happens today? What does Canada do today to address this issue?
And many people, of course, analyze the language that gets used around Israel. So passive language like Palestinians die rather than Israel kills. Mohammed Salah, recently the UEFA that announced the death of Suleiman al-Abed, the Palestinian Pele, and he's like, who killed him, right?
Yeah,
So we
that's
see
right.
this repeatedly, and I think Carney gives us a master class in that. I mean, politicians are always evasive in their language. There's a particular vagueness and evasiveness that emerges. So he says this region, like they don't even want to say Israel. Many factors that have changed, like which factors? What are you talking about? Changing conditions, so these very vague, meaningless phrases that are all word saladed together under the pretense of an answer, which of course, as you said, she follows up, so sanctions, yes or no? Like this is a yes or no question. And this is actually a symptom, I think, of the thinking on Israel. There's the fear to actually say anything concrete, the fact that they have no concrete plans, and the fact that what we're seeing reflected in the way Carney is speaking is this conflict between what they actually know to be true, because they have more information than us, and the positions they're forcing themselves to hold, which are to not challenge Israel at all. And we see this throughout our media, throughout our politicians. The only time they manage to summon clear and direct language is when they're condemning somebody, like waving a Palestinian flag or something. Then it'll be, let me be clear, there is no room for this in Canada, if you go to protest. But when you're like, hey, do you think we should starve babies? They're like, the situation on the ground is complex and there's many changing conditions.
I want to talk about another way that Canada has been complicit while it asks for, time to negotiate with its allies, time to coordinate things with the Israeli government. While these conversations are happening, we're learning a lot more about Canada continuing to send weapons directly or indirectly to Israel. So just to recap for everyone, in March of 2024, Parliament approved a non-binding motion to stop new arms permits to Israel and to review existing permits to determine whether they involved lethal weapons. In September of 2024, after almost a year of pressure from the Palestine Solidarity Movement in this country, then Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly pledged that, quote, "We will not have any forms of arms or parts of arms be sent to Gaza, period." Joly added that, quote, "How they're being sent and where they're being sent is irrelevant," unquote. Since then, we've learned of several contradictions of that stated policy. So in March of this year, a report by Project Plowshares revealed that Canada has approved a contract for artillery propellants to the United States, and that would go through the United States to the Israeli military. Project Plowshares also said that components of the F-35 fighter jets sent from Canada to the US would ultimately be sent to Israel. And just within the last couple of weeks, a report by several groups revealed that military weapons parts and ammunition were still flowing from Canada to Israel. So, Al, I know a lot of people actually don't know a lot about Canada's weapons making industry, and you out there in Nova Scotia have gone multiple times to the International Security Forum in Halifax. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit with our audience about what you've learned over the years about Canada's weapons industry.
Well, first of all, before we go there, I want to say that Anita Anand released a mendacious statement that is being challenged by the writers of the report. So I also, first of all, the idea that the report on this did not come from our mainstream media, but came from a coalition of groups, like Palestine solidarity groups that were working on this issue, I think says something. So it was reported in the media subsequently, but why was our media not following up on this weapons ban to see if that was actually happening? Why did it take community groups to do that? And then,
Specifically, I just want to name
yeah,
them, by the way, since you brought that up. World Beyond War, Palestinian Youth Movement, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, and Independent Jewish Voices were the ones behind that most recent disclosure.
Anita Anand, once that report came out, then said that they were lying and they were mistaken and that it was actually these kind of weapons and this. And that has been robustly challenged by the writers of the report. So I think it's pretty clear that Canada has continued to not be transparent and honest about what these sales are, and has, in many cases, and if we are to trust the reporting, which I do, has been, quite literally telling us lies about what is happening. Which brings us to the Halifax International Security Forum. So this is a yearly event that's held at the Westin. It's a legacy of Peter MacKay, who was defense minister under Stephen Harper. And this is an event that brings in all the warmongering nations together in Halifax. So it includes, of course, media, think tanks, literally G20 representatives, politicians, generals. They've had sessions where sitting around the table is the people that are around the table signing off on bombing Afghanistan after 9/11. Like, this is what it is. If you actually have been attending it for a while, which we have been paying attention to it, they've now taken their agenda offline, but they used to have it public. And you used to be able to see back to when this started, which was like 2009 or something. And they literally would predict what they were going to do. They would have panels in 2009 that would say things like, Syria, is it the path to Iran? War with China, is that going to be necessary? So, this is getting together and plotting the direction of future war, what the narrative will be around it, how will this get out to the media? How will academics that are complicit support this? And this is what takes place. This year, of course, they had people from Israel talking about Hamas's beheaded babies and sexual violence in Israel. But of course, nothing about Israel's actions. So it's continually used to, again, uphold this imperial militaristic order. They commit to more military funding. So this year, of course, a big issue was Trump's idea of, Canada's not pulling their weight. We need to put 2% into NATO. I talked earlier about this idea that we're supposed to pretend to not have eyes and ears and see what, Israeli officials are saying. And this is the same thing, that our officials get together and quite openly declare where they would like to wage the next war and how they're going to convince us to support it and exactly what money is going to be put towards it and what narrative is going to be deployed. And again, we don't pay too much attention to it. And then the media uncritically will spout that however many years from now when it's time to justify the next bombing, the next genocide, the next civilian death, who's the next terrorist. And so Israel is not the only example of this, right? It's the one that I think most, in so many ways, Israel acts as this litmus test for so many things: civil values that we claim to have, civil rights, free speech rights, academic freedom, the right to protest, that all of these values our countries claim to have. The minute that it's around Palestine, there's no human rights, there's no press freedom. We don't care about our colleagues being murdered. We don't care about any of this. But we should not make the mistake of thinking it's unique to Israel, and that the behaviors we see around this, from the blocking of civil liberties to the policing to the securitizing to the way that imperial powers work, Israel is one way in which they enact that. And it also happens across African nations, in Haiti, the many ways that in Venezuela, in Bolivia, across Latin America, with China, the many ways that we are promoting militarism, corporate investment in weapons. So I think we also make a mistake if we do not connect the rhetoric and behavior in Israel to these broader global militaristic and imperial forces that have continued to be active.
Finally, Elle, you mentioned international boycotts of Israel earlier on in the conversation and the refusal of nations to do that despite the genocide that's being carried out right now. You're working on a piece for The Breach right now about the upcoming Davis Cup tennis match in Halifax between Canada and Israel. This tournament is sponsored, very appropriately enough, by the way, by Scotiabank, who just cannot seem to stop taking the L on this issue. So what's the political significance of this tennis match that's coming up next month, and why are people talking about it?
People are familiar with pinkwashing, which is the use of LGBTQ plus issues to support states like Israel. So if you were gay in Gaza, they would throw you off a roof, so therefore you should support Israel. Sports washing is a similar mechanism by which sports events are used to launder the reputation of a country committing human rights violations. So, of course, sports is associated with a lot of these positive values, the achievement of the human body, like pride, the nice kind of patriotism where we cheer on Canada. And so you're able to use that celebration, those feelings, in order to convey a political message while pretending that sports is apolitical. So the rhetoric we get is that sports is a place where it's not political, it's just about competition. But at the same time, of course, we have nations representing themselves as nations, which is inherently political. Certainly those in power know that sports is political. We know that one of the most important movements about apartheid was the blocking of South Africa from international sporting competition. This was part of the BDS movement on South Africa. So Dennis Brutus, among others, advocated for South Africa to not be allowed to compete internationally, and they were banned for about 30 years from international competition. Israel, however, has not been banned from international competition and is often allowed to compete, for example, in the European pool or out of technically where they are in the Middle East to facilitate them competing. So the Davis Cup, this is the largest international tennis competition. 160 countries or whatever participate. It also serves as qualifying into the Olympics. So this is a match that will be played between Israel and Canada as a tiebreaker in Group 1. Because they, of course, are Israeli citizens, the members of the Davis Cup team have served in the IDF. So these are former IDF soldiers. And there's interviews with members of the team talking about how great their military service was. So this is not bystanders. This is not people we can say, well, not everybody in a country is guilty. You shouldn't hold people accountable. These are people that have participated in occupation and apartheid. Secondly, we know that Russia, for example, was banned from international sporting competition, and particularly the Davis Cup in 2022. So Tennis Canada, along with international tennis, prevented Russia from competing. The athletes can compete independently, but they can't compete as Russia. And this was, of course, in response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So solidarity was expressed with the Ukraine, and Russia faced sanctions. So there's a precedent already set within international sports. But yeah, when it comes to Israel, we are told, and we're literally told this morning, I literally just watched Tennis Canada present at Halifax City Council at the special events meeting, where they said that sports is not political and is a vehicle for unity, at the same time as they were discussing the costs of policing us to prevent us from protesting. Like, how would they securitize this event against the people living in Halifax? But sports is not political. They also said that this event will bring $2.2 million in economic benefit to Halifax, which is a deeply morbidly ironic number, because that 2.2 million is the population of Gaza before Israel began its genocide on October 7th. So we have quite literally priced out Palestinian life at $1 per Palestinian. And that is the cost that Israel will have for some of this optics and PR that Robin Urbach has been decrying. So we will allow Israel to come in. We will allow them to play a tennis match, to be clapped, to be cheered. We will treat it as business as usual and act like sports is not a vehicle for ideology, even as the national anthems are played, even as everybody waves and wears the flag. And how can that not be about the ideology of the nation? So this is not about punishing individual athletes. Whether or not, however complicit athletes are or not, is not the question. The question is that, as Dennis Brutus told us, you don't do business as usual. It is not normal when the situation is abnormal. And you do not allow nations the platform to come and be celebrated at a time when they are committing genocide. And sports, when you allow that to happen, or culture, things like Eurovision or whatever, when you allow that to happen, you are laundering Israel's crimes, and you are acting like we can have normal relations with Israel. And when we question, why can't we kick out the ambassadors? Why aren't we putting in an arms embargo? Why are we not putting sanctions? Why are we doing business as usual with Israel with arms? That extends to the business as usual we plan to do with a sporting match. So of course, this is a major event that is taking place, and we expect a major response. It is incredibly important that people in Halifax and beyond, first of all, send letters to our city council and to Tennis Canada to let them know that this shall not stand. Israel should not play on the bodies of dead Palestinians. Second of all, of course, we will have to protest it. And what it demonstrates, because we already know that there will be an enhanced security response. They spoke about this morning, that, okay, it's 2.2 million in economic benefit, but what about the cost of policing? This is a question that quite rightly was asked. Like, they're correct. What about the cost of policing? They are going to have to police us. And so we are yet again going to be treated at the spectacle of Canadians elbows up, in our own cities, being police surveyed, potentially beaten down, restricted from our own city, held behind barriers, etc. All of that to defend Israel to come in to play tennis. And this is yet another example of the way that Canada continues, while spewing empty rhetoric around humanitarian crises and how sad this is and how something must be done, but just not by us and just not really by Israel, not really to Israel, but something. But let's also play tennis at the same time and claddle. So as I said, I think the theme all along has been that I think people want to be persuaded by some of these empty words. We want to believe that something's changing. We want to believe, of course, and I do believe that our actions have made a difference because public opinion has shifted. This went from being the so-called fringe to being, I think, a very mainstream opinion. Everybody, you weren't seeing images from Gaza on the news. You are now. You weren't hearing from Palestinians. That is breaking through. So the work that Palestinians primarily did, and then those in solidarity, has made a difference. I don't want to suggest it hasn't, but I don't want us to ever believe that our politicians or major corporations or sports organizations or whoever it is operating from some place where they have a moral compass or a conscience. They don't. They don't. And the only way that we ever get them is to hit their pocketbooks and to make it intolerable for them to continue their actions. And we will be doing that in Halifax, September 12th to 13th, demonstrating to them exactly how intolerable this is and exactly how contemptible they are.
Yeah, I imagine it's not going to be business as usual for many people in your city. And we're really looking forward to your upcoming piece about all of this for The Breach. And as we end, because this is a conversation about Canadian complicity in Israel's genocide, I have to, as a journalist, talk about the killing on Sunday of Al Jazeera journalist Anas al-Sharif, a very, very well-known journalist who's bringing war correspondence to the world over the last almost 2 years, and before that, of course, too, who was killed by Israel on Sunday alongside several of his colleagues. They were attacked outside of the main gate of Gaza City's Al-Shifa hospital. The attack killed Anas al-Sharif as well as Mohammed Kreke, camera operators Ibrahim Zaher and Mohammed Nufal. Also killed were freelance cameraman Momen Aliwa and freelance journalist Mohammed Al-Khalidi. And we continue to see in this country the repeated refusal of our mainstream media, of media advocacy organizations in Canada, the refusal to talk about, let alone condemn, the killing of journalists, 237 by Al Jazeera's count, since the siege on Gaza began 22 months ago. So I think a good place to end this conversation would be to honor the lives of Anas al-Sharif and all of his colleagues who were killed on Sunday, to honor the lives of all of the journalists who have been murdered since this conflict began, and to say that we do have a responsibility as Canadian journalists to continue speaking out about what is happening to our colleagues, without whom we could not actually be doing the work in this country. We'll have to end it there for now, Elle. Thanks today for your thoughts.
Thank you, Desmond.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.